Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar today on responding to COVID-19, rapid development and launch strategies for diagnostics, vaccines, and therapeutics in a global pandemic. Before we get started with today's presentation, I would like to go over some brief housekeeping items with everyone. For those of you who may have questions about any of today's topics, we do invite you to type them into the Q&A widget available on your viewing screen. We will do our best to answer all of your questions at the end of the program, time permitting. However, if we are not able to get to your question today, we will be certain to follow up with you via email directly. Please also note that we are recording today's program and will make the on-demand presentation materials accessible via Foley.com once they are available. As an added reference, we encourage you to visit our Coronavirus Resource Center page on Foley.com, where we offer insights from across Foley's many practice disciplines on what companies such as yours can do now in response to the legal and business impact of the current coronavirus outbreak, as well as how you can prepare for the future. An index of articles can be found in the resource widget located on the bottom left side of your screen, as well as if you would like to receive coronavirus-related alerts in real time, you can also visit our Coronavirus Resource Center page and complete the available form to subscribe to our mailing list. Additionally, this past Wednesday, several attorney members from our Coronavirus Task Force hosted a webinar entitled Managing the Commercial Impact of Coronavirus, which covered the key legal and business considerations in-house counsel and business leaders are facing related to COVID-19, as well as practical solutions, to prepare for the future. Several of the core topics addressed on this program included supply chain, including impacts from manufacturing, automotive and OE shutdown, and technology industries, force majeure clauses, labor and employment issues, and government action. To access the on-demand webinar recording, Q&A discussion, and presentation slides from this program, you can visit the link on your screen, bit.ly/managing the commercial impact. These resources are also available on Foley.com. Finally, if you do happen to experience any technical difficulties with the webinar platform throughout today's program, please try refreshing your browser or refer to the webcast help guide on your screen. If you do continue to have difficulties, feel free to send us a note via the Q&A widget as well. At this time, I will go ahead and turn it over to our presenters who will provide introductions and a very brief overview of today's program before getting started.
Thanks, Allison. This is Nate Beaver. I'm a partner in Foley's Washington, D.C. office. I specialize in the area of FDA regulatory, and I'm happy to speak with everyone here today.
And hi, everyone. This is Steve Mabius. I'm an IP partner in Foley's Washington office, specializing in biotechnology and pharmaceutical patents.
And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Frank Murray. I'm a partner also in the Washington, D.C. office for Foley, and I practice in the area of government contracts and government procurement, and I'm really glad to be able to be here today.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is David Rosen of Foley & Lardner II, Washington, D.C.'s office. I'm a pharmacist as well as an attorney. I spent 15 years at FDA, and I run the FDA practice as well as the co-chair of the life sciences industry team for the firm.
Hi, everyone. This is Crystal Shore. I am an IP partner in Foley's Washington, D.C. office, and I'm chair of the Chemical, Biotechnology, and Pharmaceutical Practice Group.
And good morning from California. I'm Judy Waltz. I'm co-chair of our healthcare practice group and healthcare industry team, and obviously a health lawyer in San Francisco, and am very thankful to all of you for joining with us today to talk about these hot topics.
And with that intro, I will start with the agenda for today and quickly run through the areas that our multidisciplinary presenters are going to cover. So the first area will be FDA actions and guidance, and that will be followed by a discussion of product reimbursement considerations and how compensation will work for healthcare delivery during the pandemic. And the third area we'd like to cover today is government contract and procurement issues relating to the potential for the government to be a customer of products and services related to COVID-19. And lastly, we'll cover some intellectual property considerations that are unique to the COVID-19 situation. And finally, we'll get to the question and answer session. So with that, I will turn it over to Nate Beaver and Dave Rosen to start with the FDA section.
Thanks, Steve. This is Nate Beaver again. We're going to be talking on a number of FDA topics, but focusing on emergency use authorizations and FDA actions under COVID-19. As you can imagine, the situation is very fluid, with new guidance being published almost daily. I'll run through a list that's provided, touching on a couple of areas, but will not touch on everything on the slide, but want to give you a sense of the areas that FDA is focusing on at this time. Let's start at a high level, though, when we talk about emergency use authorization. What is it? On February 14th, 2020, pursuant to the Pandemic and All Hazard Preparedness Reauthorization Act, the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, Secretary Alex Azar, determined that there is a public health emergency that has significant potential to affect the national security or health and security of U.S. Citizens that involves the virus that causes COVID-19. So this determination has now authorized FDA under the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Authorization Act to enact, to sustain and strengthen the national preparedness with respect to agents involving chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear agents, which include infectious disease threats such as the pandemic we're currently facing. So it's opened up a large toolbox that FDA now has with respect to emergency use authorizations. The FDA commissioner can now authorize the emergency use of an unapproved medical product or an unapproved use of a medical product for certain emergency circumstances, which of course would not otherwise be permissible but for this new authority. FDA can issue an EUA to allow a medical countermeasure to be used in an emergency to diagnose, treat, or prevent serious or life-threatening diseases or conditions caused by an agent when there are no other adequate, approved, or available alternatives. Here are some of the recent guidance that FDA has published. There's actually new guidance that's out today as well, but I just wanted to touch on a couple of these as I'll go through them. So for example, yesterday FDA published information for healthcare providers about convalescence plasma collected from the blood of fully recovered COVID-19 patients and given as treatment to very ill COVID-19 patients. FDA is permitting licensed physicians to request emergency use INDs and to obtain COVID-19 convalescent plasma from blood centers. FDA has noted they're not providing convalescent plasma themselves, but are certainly reviewing those EAUs as quickly as they can come in for particular patients who may need this particular therapy. You see March 23rd, 22nd, and 22nd, FDA has focused on collaborating with the EMEA with respect to a potential vaccine, has addressed information with respect to REM drugs, and obviously there's a pressing need with respect to ventilators, and FDA has provided some guidance in that area as well. FDA has also issued its first emergency use authorization for a point-of-care diagnostic and has been very focused on making available diagnostic tests as quickly as possible, which I'll touch on with some further information in a moment. One point I did want to also make is that FDA has also been aggressive in policing what they perceive as either fraudulent or potentially dangerous COVID-19 tests. And so, for example, FDA has not authorized any tests that is available for purchase for testing at home for COVID-19. And the guidance that I'll discuss in a moment applicable to both manufacturers and labs is only for those that are manufactured in CLIA facilities or by a manufacturer and where the testing is done as an appropriate lab. So it is certainly the case that FDA is looking at the market and making determinations and enforcing against products that they believe that do not have appropriate authorization or are potentially fraudulent, and I think we'll continue to see that. With respect to diagnostic emergency use authorizations, as you can see, there have been a number that have been issued. On the 16th, we saw ones issued to both Hologic and LabCorp. There are others for other manufacturers as well. And David will be talking about some of those specific EUAs, later in the presentation. There we see an emergency use authorization to Thermo Fisher as well. And on March 12th, and which I'll talk about in some additional detail, FDA had given some flexibility to the New York State Department of Health with respect to the issuance of emergency use authorizations. All right, I want to talk about the summary of recent FDA actions for labs. FDA has now authorized states to allow high complexity clinical laboratories to offer COVID tests without first obtaining an EUA. Why this is important is because initially FDA had announced on March 12th that it would allow New York State to authorize certain laboratories in that state to offer validated COVID-19 testing without first obtaining an EAU from FDA, provided that such laboratories met certain requirements established by the state. What we've seen here is that FDA has tried to enforce as much flexibility as possible. Initially, EAUs were required to go through and be approved by FDA. On March 12th, they made a determination that they would cede some of that authority to certain states, New York, for example, here. And then on March 16th, FDA announced a blanket policy extending that authority to the remaining 49 states. So essentially now, for labs that are interested in that meet the high complexity clinical laboratory standards for CLIA, they can either go through FDA to obtain and submit their EAU, or they can do it through their individual states that they are located in. States to which they engage directly with state authorities and can now offer their tests without first obtaining an EAU. FDA has only requested that states notify the FDA if they intend to use this flexibility to expedite COVID-19 testing, and that while FDA will not review the process adopted by any individual state to review the testing, they do expect states to require laboratories to validate their tests prior to clinical use. With respect to actions for manufacturers, FDA has now authorized also manufacturers to distribute validated COVID-19 tests prior to submission of an EAU. They expanded the policy with respect to CLIA certified clinical laboratories that perform high complexity tests, and FDA has now taken the position that commercial test kit manufacturers can also distribute COVID-19 tests for a reasonable period of time after the manufacturer's validation of that test, provided that the manufacturer, one, is preparing an EAU request, and two, provides instructions for use of the test and data about the test performance characteristics on the manufacturer's website to be as transparent as possible about the information and validation that they have done on the test. Following completion of an assay validation, manufacturers should notify FDA via email that their assay has been validated and that they intend to begin distribution. FDA has requested that the manufacturers notify and submit a completed EUA request to FDA within 15 business days of notifying FDA that the assay has been validated. FDA notably has also included template submissions for EUA requests. And that, of course, if FDA is ultimately not able to authorize that EUA within the time period after submission, they would expect the manufacturer to suspend distribution and conduct a recall of that test. With respect to serology tests, prior to March 16th, FDA's guidance had really focused on nucleic acid-based tests for the detection However, FDA has now provided guidance and information to both manufacturers and laboratories who are seeking to develop antibody tests. What they have said generally about antibody tests is that they don't intend to object to the development of the use, provided that the test has been validated, that the test developer provides notice to the FDA, and that a warning statement is included with the test that suggests that negative results do not rule out COVID-19 infections when antibody tests are used, and that results from such testing should not be used as a sole basis to either diagnose or exclude COVID-19 infection. FDA has also provided some specific recommendations for antigen detection and serology validation studies, including limit of detection, cross-reactivity, microbial interference, and other clinical agreement studies as may be applicable. I can also say that from personal experience, the FDA staff and officials who are working on these are very responsive, very available. I had a call with someone on Sunday night at 9 p.m. on one of these issues. FDA immediately picked up the phone and had numerous email correspondence back and forth. So they're very focused on this, very willing to discuss with either manufacturers or labs who are interested in this area, and I would encourage you to reach out with any questions. With that, I'm going to pause and then kick it over to my colleague David Rosen to pick up the slides from here.
So are there any other, if there's no other comments or questions, I will just get rolling from here. There are a number of eligibilities for EUAs. You know, FDA has allowed people to extend expiration dating for products, and so that's very nice to be able to do that. And it allows for emergency dispensing without having an individual prescription. And allows physicians not to necessarily have to be licensed in the particular state for which they are residing in order to dispense particular products. So it's pretty good in order to get access to products for FDA-approved products, that's for sure. And we want to make sure that there are no shortages in this situation. Again, Nate talked about before there has to be a declaration by the HHS, and he talked about Alex Azar, the Secretary of HHS, making the declaration justifying emergency use, and that has been done, so I'm not going to really go over this at this point in time. Again, some more of the requirements in terms for making that EUA declaration, but they've already done that at this point. So as Nate said, there's been a number of EUAs that have been granted to date, and we just have a list of those. Those are available on the FDA website. Just wanted you to know that this is a very active area and that FDA is being very responsive. As Nate has said, we have been getting calls during nights and weekends, and so it's really proud to see that the Food and Drug Administration is really going above to make sure that people get access to the products that they really need. Okay, so lots of emergency use authorizations have been granted, as you can see. So what has to be in one of these emergency use authorizations? You know, we need to know a little bit about the mechanism of action. We need to have some sort of evidence that the product is actually working. We need to know a little bit of effectiveness in animals, if there is an animal model with respect to drug products, and whether or not the product could solely based or is being developed based on the animal rule that says you can, instead of conducting trials in humans, you can actually use the animal model to support approval of a particular product. So again, human experience, we're looking for published case reports or any other relevant human experience. You've seen a lot of data and anecdotal information about chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine in combination with azithromycin in France that's being used. We don't want a run on those particular products, but there's anecdotal evidence. So that's the kind of thing, though, that we would put in an EUA for a drug product that would provide some additional support for what's going on here. Again, maybe some PK and PD data associated with this. For the in vitro diagnostics, as Nate noted, we need some performance data with respect to sensitivity and specificity to know that the product is able to detect the virus or the antibody associated with the virus, as well as we're not getting too much false negatives or false positives. So as part of the template, again, I've talked about the safety and effectiveness data. Any kind of source data, the actual source data is really important to include. It doesn't have to be extensive, but it really has to be enough to help FDA make that determination. And they want to do it in a quick time frame, so we're trying to do this in a very focused and specific way and trying to make sure that FDA has the data that they can review quickly that really does demonstrate that the products are able to perform the way they are supposed to perform in the case of an in vitro diagnostic, or has the potential to work well as an antiviral agent in this situation. We have to provide any information to mitigate the risk and to optimize the benefit, any limitations, uncertainty, or data gaps. Anytime there's any contraindications or warnings or things of that sort that need to be known, and anything with respect to known to the threats by these particular agents. And so we know what the threat now is with respect to COVID-19. So fair amount of information and quick data associated with that at this point. Again, for the contents, I've kind of gone through this. Are there any approved alternatives to that? That's kind of what we're looking at this point. There aren't any drug products that have really been approved or as alternatives at this point other than supportive measures. And we've seen FDA provide a number of guidance with respect to the diagnostic testing at this point. So it's nice that we have, we should be seeing the results of FDA's actions on these EUAs and products being available to the front lines where we need to get a significant number of more people tested in this situation. Again, a description of the product, its intended use, pretty straightforward. Information on whether or not the product is approved and it's an unapproved use, or whether or not the product is unapproved, and whether or not it has been submitted as an investigational application, either as an IND or an IDE to the respective centers, either the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or the Center for Devices for Radiological Health, or the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. Any foreign information or foreign test data, we found that a lot of the tests, a lot of the diagnostic tests have received clearance for marketing in foreign countries, as well as CE marking, and all that is very helpful in terms of helping FDA make its determination. And then, if there's alternative products and adequacy around the world and things of that sort, that would help in making these determinations. I think I've kind of gone through that, most of the stuff on this page, but a little bit of the manufacturing and the specifications that are used for each particular product. A little bit information on the availability and the continued availability and the capability to continue to produce these products on a timely basis, and either some sort of instructions for use or FDA package insert or information for healthcare professionals who would be using that product. I already talked a little bit about the extension of the expiration date, which is nice to have in case we need products that have been short-dated, and any right of reference to any other materials, either INDs or things like that, that might be available on the FDA website. Again, we've provided the link to these templates, and the templates, I would suggest that if companies are going to prepare these, that they follow these templates, because that's what FDA has asked for, and it'll make the review of those applications go a lot smoother and a lot quicker. Nate, do you want to talk about the PrEP Act for a second?
Sure. Thanks, David. I'll talk briefly about this. I just want to bring it to people's attention so that you're aware of its existence. Under the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, the PrEP Act, which was enacted in 2005 by Congress, it authorizes the Secretary of HHS to issue a PrEP Act declaration in response to a public health emergency. A PrEP Act declaration provides immunity from tort liability claims except for willful misconduct to individuals or organizations involved in the manufacture, distribution, or dispensing of medical countermeasures. And on March 17th, HHS published its declaration of, with respect to COVID-19. So the PrEP Act is now applicable with respect to COVID-19 preparedness steps. Let me move to the next slide here.
Is that not working? All right, I got it for you.
I get my mouse to work. No, I got it.
Okay.
So the PrEP Act does provide for limited immunity, as well as authorizes essentially a process that anyone subject to a tort has to go through rather than being able to bring suit against a company itself. So it creates an emergency fund in the U.S. Treasury to provide compensation for injuries that are directly caused by administration or use of a countermeasure that's covered by the Secretary's declaration, and that's administered by the Health Resources and Services Administration. What the law does not do is that it only provides limited immunity from liability from persons, activities, and countermeasures specified in the declaration. It does not automatically protect everyone involved in any kind of medical response to an emergency. So it's certainly worth, if you're looking at either developing diagnostics or being involved in COVID in some way, it's worth looking to see whether you may have limited immunity coverage under the PrEP Act or not. David, with that, I'll kick it back over to you.
Great.
Nate, before you move on, Nate, I just wanted to jump in with a quick question that we got about the limited immunity. If somebody, let's say an employer who has essential operation, were to offer an unapproved or EUA-approved on-site diagnostic test to its employees, including with the physician on site, would there be any special liability issues they need to think about in that scenario?
If it is being, if a countermeasure here to COVID is being applied, then the PrEP Act should apply in that particular situation. So there will be a limited immunity benefit to those types of activities.
Thank you. All right, this is David again. We've had some questions about FDA's expedited review process, fast track, breakthrough therapy, accelerated approval, and priority review. So I wanted to just spend a few minutes going over that at this point. So the purpose, again, of expedited review is to make therapies available for serious conditions, get them approved and available as soon as possible, provided that FDA can balance that risk-benefit equation, and it'll speed the development of products while preserving appropriate standards of safety and efficacy. Some key concepts. What is a serious condition? It's one that has a substantial impact on day-to-day functioning. It's associated with morbidity, and if it's left untreated, it will progress from a less severe to a more severe type of condition. And you can see some of the examples that are provided here. What's an available therapy is one that's approved and licensed for the same indication, and the product is relevant to the U.S. standard of care for that particular indication. It can be for a different study population. that's eligible to receive the product under the ATASU or Elements to Assure Safe Use REMS program. It does not, available therapy does not include a product that has been granted accelerated approval based on surrogate or intermediate endpoints. We'll talk a little bit about the accelerated approval program, where the clinical benefit hasn't been verified by post-approval studies. And sometimes FDA will consider an off-label therapy that is not FDA regulated too. What's an unmet medical need? You know, if there's available therapy exists, then whether a new treatment has an effect on the outcome of that condition that's not addressed by the available therapy, provides comparable efficacy but avoids safety or toxicity types of issues, or provides comparable safety and efficacy to the existing therapy but has documented benefit, i.e. improved compliance. Sometimes you might see that in terms of an injectable product versus an oral product, for example. And again, they will consider products as an unmet medical need if other products were approved through the accelerated approval program. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Again, these are the 4 different types of programs, and some of the benefits and the limitations of those here. What I'm going to do is kind of just spend a minute and go through each one of those so that you can understand what they are and how they differ a little bit. So for a fast track, you know, it's the potential to demonstrate an unmet medical need. They all have the serious condition in non-clinical data demonstrate the potential. It could be a product that's been designated as a qualified infectious disease product. If the type of data that you need is either non-clinical model or some sort of pharmacological data, and then any available clinical data that could demonstrate the potential to address that unmet medical need. Again, what do you get out of this? You get to talk to FDA through quicker types of development meetings. You're eligible for priority review. That's a review within a much shorter time frame, within 4 to 6 months. And you get a rolling review, which is very nice because you can submit the data as it becomes available. And the designation may be withdrawn, of course, if the product no longer meets the fast track qualifying criteria. When to submit a fast track request with the IND or after, but no later than the pre-BLA or pre-NDA type of meeting, and then you've got the regulatory authority for that. With respect to breakthrough therapy, you see the same type of criteria, okay? There's intended to treat a serious condition and preliminary clinical evidence, though. That's the clinical evidence indicates that it may have a substantial improvement on a clinically significant endpoint over the available therapy. You know, you might gather that clinical evidence in phase 1 or phase 2 trials. And so those are, and there can be a number of different types of data to support that. It may be the new treatment may provide a better or a greater response, and it may modify the long-term effect of the disease. Looking at the clinically significant endpoint criteria, those are pretty straightforward with this too. And sometimes they'll allow a biomarker to be able to use too if there's a correlation between the biomarker and the clinically meaningful effect on the underlying disease. Again, you get all the fast track features. You get intensive guidance, an organizational commitment from FDA, including the senior management, and it could be eligible for priority review and the rolling review. And again, all these can be withdrawn if the product or the situation no longer meets the qualifying criteria. When do you submit? With the IND, but no later than the end of phase 2 meeting. Accelerated approval. This is one that I worked on when I was at FDA during the AIDS crisis, where a product has It's to treat a serious condition and provides a meaningful advantage over available therapy and demonstrates an effect on a validated clinical endpoint. So we have to look at what that endpoint is and how that correlates with the disease state. And with in the antiviral and the AIDS area, it was CD4 cell counts and impact on CD4 cell counts, either the maintenance of existing levels or the improvement of CD4 cell counts that served as the basis of accelerated approvals for didanosine and then later antiretroviral drug products in the AIDS epidemic. Again, what you have to deal with the surrogate marker situation, and you need to have some sort of evidence that that surrogate marker is appropriate and it has an impact on an intermediate clinical endpoint or some sort of benefit for that particular disease state. Okay. Again, the approval is based on an effect on the surrogate or an intermediate endpoint. It has to meet the same criteria for approval: substantial evidence of safety and effectiveness, and sufficient information that the drug is safe for use under the conditions prescribed. There are some additional considerations: submission of promotional materials for review. There is a requirement for post-marketing types of trials, and may be subjected to expedited withdrawal, which was the case with Avastin in the oncology area at one point. Has come back and is available, but that was one of the first products that was withdrawn under the accelerated approval program. Again, when to submit, you should be discussing this with the FDA review division during the product development and what you plan on doing in order to support a request for accelerated approval. Prior to review, again, this is just a quicker review, okay, would provide a significant improvement of safety or effectiveness. It's something to do to support a pediatric study or as a qualified infectious disease. And the good part about that is you get a priority review voucher as a result of that too, which is very nice, under the qualified infectious disease situation too. So, what are the criteria? We have evidence of increased effectiveness in the treatment of prevention of diagnosis disease, reduction in the treatment of limiting adverse event, some sort of enhancement in patient compliance that could lead to an improvement in serious outcomes, evidence of safety and effectiveness in a new patient population, and evidence from trials comparing investigational products to a marketed particular product. So priority review, again, 4 to 6 month review of an NDA is very good, so very, very quick. Shorter review time, 6 months, it's even quicker at this point in time, and it's just something that is really available to help speed up the availability of products that have a very promising impact to affect patients' health and well-being, especially in serious and debilitating life-threatening diseases where there are no other treatment alternatives available. I wanted just to talk a little bit about the guidance on conducting clinical trials in COVID-19 situation, because that's important. We need to think about ongoing trials and the potential impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the safety of trial participants. And the question is, do we continue recruitment of patients? Do we continue use of that investigation of products for subjects already participating in the trial? And is there a need to change or change patient monitoring? It is important to keep participants informed of changes to the study and monitoring the plans and monitoring plans that could really impact their participation in that trial. So we want to make sure that we have those types of situations available. We have to look at alternative methods for safety assessments, such as phone contacts, virtual visits, different locations and things of that sort. If trial participants who don't have access to the product or the investigational site may and need additional safety monitoring, and whether it's appropriate to delay some assessments for ongoing trials, or if the study can't be properly conducted, to stop recruitment and withdraw trial participants. So again, this is unique times, and we really, the people that are participating in clinical trials, they're scarce resources. We want to make sure that we don't do anything to impact their safety of those subjects that are participating in those trials, so we have to be cognizant of that for those trials that are ongoing. We can, look at changes to the protocol, and they can be implemented without IRB or without IRB approval and without filing an amendment, but you should be reporting those to both afterwards, and you should be in close communication with both the IRB and the FDA reviewing division. And we have to think about this before we initiate any new studies too, because of the limitations on travel at this point in time. So I think, given where we are with respect to people sheltering in place, my recommendation would not be to initiate trials at this point until we get a better handle on what's going on in the pandemic. Okay, with that, I'm going to end, and I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Judy Waltz, to talk a little bit about product reimbursement. Thank you.
Thank you, David. This is Judy Waltz, and I'm actually not going to speak much about reimbursement. I'm going to talk more about CLIA, but for those of you who are anxious to hear about reimbursement, I will note that in the CARES bill that came out of the Senate last night, and presumably will get through the House without any changes, Section 3718 delays the cuts to laboratory reimbursement that were scheduled to go into effect. These were set in place several years ago in PAMA, which stands for the Protecting Access to Medicare Act, and it was designed to link Medicare reimbursements for lab services to what's paid in the private sector. And what has happened is that labs have found their Medicare reimbursements cut dramatically. So this will delay this year's cuts for a year, and that is going to be some welcome relief, assuming that provision gets through the House as well. So I want to just talk a little bit about the clinical laboratory improvement amendments. Nate and I have been working a lot together in the last week, so you've heard about the wonderful tests and the processes that are being developed. They have to be performed in a clinical laboratory. So I have pulled out the statutory definition, because in crazy times like these, sometimes it gets easy to forget about meeting the legal requirements. For those of you on the call who work for healthcare facilities, so providers, you know that CMS has issued a number of waivers of various provisions and requirements to facilitate operations. There have been none that have been issued with respect to CLIA. So CLIA is moving forward, untouched so far by efforts to adapt. So you'll see where I'm going with this. I decided to just highlight a couple of issues that we've actually seen in the past couple weeks here as clinical laboratories are trying to ramp up to perform testing. So this is the statutory definition of a clinical laboratory. You can see the part in red, materials derived from the human body for purposes of providing information for diagnosis, prevention, or treatment. So this is a very broad definition. A few years ago, there was some litigation, and David and I think, worked on some of this, that contended that laboratories that were performing DNA analysis were not actually performing, I don't even remember what their argument was. But anyway, that was rather soundly defeated, and CLIA has proceeded accordingly. So this is the regulatory definition. It matches up with the statutory definition. It goes a little bit further. So you can see the last sentence that's highlighted in red. Facilities only collecting or preparing specimens or both, or only serving as a mailing service and not performing testing, are not considered laboratories. This is very important for those entities who may be on this call who are setting up specimen collection sites. Now, this is federal law. States vary in terms of what they're requiring in terms of state law registration of specimen collection sites. But from a CLIA perspective, you can do that without a CLIA certificate. So that's important. So the CLIA certificate is required for every lab that is doing specimen testing, meeting those definitions that we just talked about. There are varying levels of certificates. The most, or at least the earliest tests that were coming out for COVID testing were at the multi-complexity level. That means you would need a multi-complexity level CLIA certificate to perform those tests in accordance with the law. There are some, as I've learned primarily from Nate in the last week, there are some coming out that the FDA has characterized as moderate complexity. So those take a somewhat lesser standard for a CLIA certificate. I've also been told by CMS that they can get you CLIA numbers, including for high complexity labs, in 24 hours, which is pretty quick. You still have to meet all the requirements, but assuming that you do, you're not going to be waiting 6 months for a survey. You can get one right away. In addition to the appropriate level of complexity for your certificate, you also need to have the right specialization. And at least Region 9, which is where I live, California, Region 9 has characterized these as virology tests, so you would need to have the specialization there and meet the requirements for that line of testing to perform these tests. There are certain exceptions to CLIA, and these have come up as an issue in the last couple of weeks as well. The most significant one relates to research laboratories, which is number 2 here. So research laboratories are not required to have CLIA certificates. The hitch is they cannot report patient-specific results for diagnosis, prevention, or treatment of any disease. CMS has on its website an explanation of this, and their position is that research labs can release aggregate results. So, 40 out of 100 are testing positive for COVID, or 20 out of whatever. But you cannot say, you cannot go back to the individual patient or characterize your research findings in that manner. So I did follow up with CMS today and asked if they were going to be waiving the requirements for research laboratories, because these laboratories are often really well situated to perform some additional testing. They may have the equipment, they've got the training, but they still need a CLIA certificate, and CMS says they're not going to offer any waivers on that front. So remember that CLIA is operated as a partnership where FDA is categorizing the tests, CMS is processing the applications and taking the enforcement actions, and then we've got CDC there also playing an increasingly bigger role. They're providing the analysis, et cetera. So if you're looking for CLIA questions, depending on what exactly your question is, is it the category of the test, or is it how you get a CLIA certificate, or what, you need to look out for the various players in all of that. And this is another test going into some of the issues that I've just mentioned. So one more point, the CLIA regulations require an order from an authorized person as defined by state law for the CLIA-certified lab to perform the test. So most states only have a handful, or a few more than a handful, of tests that they will allow a patient to self-order. So if, and these will all be defined by state law, so that will need to be tracked down. So individuals will generally not be able to show up and just say they want to be tested here. They're going to have to be, the test is going to have to be ordered by their physician and the results only released to the physician unless state law authorizes otherwise. And again, I mentioned this previously, but I want to just remind people, specimen collection isn't regulated by CLIA, but again, it may require state law approvals. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Frank, and he's going to talk about government contracts. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. So Frank Murray here, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about it's framed as government contracts and procurement, but the first couple of slides are really on government funding. The government funds research and development opportunities in these areas, particularly now. There's obviously a very high demand for therapeutics, diagnostics, and vaccines related to COVID-19. And so one of the primary avenues for that is BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority through HHS that has these broad agency announcements. What they do is they sort of identify a number of areas of interest that they have of different things that they'd like to have developed, researched and developed, and provide funding for, and give an opportunity for interested parties to submit white papers or proposals with ideas about things that they want to get government funding to investigate. And, they had one that's been outstanding for a while that had a vast array of topics that they recently have sort of said, we're not considering anything right now other than COVID-19 issues. Everything else, if you have a proposal for it, we'll take it, but we'll put it, in a queue to consider once we deal with the COVID-19 issue. So right now, they're really only considering proposals actively for COVID-19 diagnostic assays, therapeutics, and vaccines. Within that, there is now, they can award various types of vehicles to do that research and development. It can be a contract. And those are presumptively going to be cost-sharing contracts because the idea is that you, as the contracting party, are going to be getting some benefit out of this economically once you've developed the research and development and reach something that's got commercial practicability. So you should have some skin in the game and not just require the government to pay for everything. There are also grants and cooperative agreements, CRADAs, cooperative agreements for research and development. And then there's also this other interesting animal called other transactions agreements. And particularly within this field, there are called other transactions for advanced research, or OTARs. Those have been authorized, within HHS and BARDA under the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness and Advancing Innovation Act of 2019, so fairly recently. But they are considered a non-acquisition instrument. So they're not considered a contract. That's why they're called agreements. And what that does is it takes them out of the world of strict government contracting where there are a lot of federal acquisition regulation contract clauses that have to be imposed in certain types of contracts. And, it gives you more flexibility to negotiate some of those issues. I'll skip ahead a bullet here and just say, some of that flexibility is that within the government and the FAR, there are government cost principles that have to be applied, and that may be different from GAAP principles, and this allows you to sort of use more traditional non-governmental accounting practices to account for your costs if it's a cost reimbursement situation. And there are also issues where you may be required to provide or asked to provide cost and pricing data to validate some of the pricing that you're providing the government, and it can make some of that more negotiable as opposed to mandatory. and it can also give you a little bit more flexibility to negotiate some of the IP terms as opposed to the very rigid IP provisions that are in the FAR. And so those are all benefits, and they're intended to help attract non-traditional government contractors. So if you're someone who does a lot of government contracting and you're used to complying with the government regime, these may not be strictly available to you, but if you're someone in the commercial sector who doesn't normally do that and would be perhaps daunted by trying to comply with the FAR clauses, it's a nice avenue to provide some flexibility. Now, when the government is providing some funding for research and development, there can be some issues about what rights the government gets in the intellectual property that's developed. And typically, there's a couple of types of intellectual property that we typically talk about in government contracting. There's the patent rights, and then there's technical data rights. And technical data is technical or scientific data that's exchanged, that's delivered to the government. And typically, when you're dealing with a mixed funding situation where the government's putting some money in towards the development of that data, the government seeks and tries to get what's called government purpose rights. And that, as the name somewhat implies, it is allowing the government to do things with that data for governmental purposes. It can't use it for commercial purposes. It can't take that out and give it to a competitor of yours and say, go out and sell these things commercially and give me a cut. But if the government is procuring stuff for its own need, and it has that data and it has government purpose rights on it, it can share that data with a government contractor and say, here's this data, produce this for me, or use this data to help produce something for me, and you're producing it for me as the federal government, and so they have those rights. Now, the template OTAR that BARDA publishes does provide, and the general concept in these situations is that the government wants to incentivize practical application, commercial application of these inventions, and so the principal is allowed to retain the title in the patent, but they need to reduce it to practical application, or else then the government could potentially march in if they don't think you're doing anything with the invention. But generally speaking, they're going to be favorable patent rights for the contractor or the researcher in these mixed funding situations. Now, once you get past the research and development phase, now you've actually got a solution, you've got a vaccine or a therapeutic that you can produce, and the government wants to buy. You're now entering the world of procurement contracts, where the government is entering into a contract to purchase something from you and a certain good or service. And so those contracts are different from grants and cooperative agreements, where generally the government's not buying something directly from you, but they're funding you to develop something with a general public good. And so government procurement contracts are subject to the Federal Acquisition Regulation and some general government contract compliance obligations. And one area where it's gotten a lot of press recently is the Defense Production Act. And I did want to highlight that because the name makes it sound like it's, and the act itself refers to national defense, which sounds military in nature, and that's how it was originally conceived when it was passed, in the beginning of the Korean War. But it's been expanded over time for the concept of national defense to cover natural disasters or other national emergencies, and so it does reach a pandemic emergency under the Stafford Act, and HHS can invoke Defense Production Act requirements. And so one of the things that the concept under the Defense Production Act, the DPA, is this thing called rated orders. And rated orders are, the government assigns certain priorities and says, you've got a DO rating or a DX rating, and then you have to prioritize those rated orders over any other orders you have, whether other governmental orders that don't have ratings or commercial orders, which obviously wouldn't have ratings. And so that's part of the kind of the public debate right now about whether the president should be using this DPA authority or not, is that if he does use it and he does issue these rated orders, then it really does force a company to prioritize the production of that order and fulfillment of that order over anything else they might be doing. And so, as pointed out here, it kind of allows the government to jump to the head of the line and say, you have to produce this for me. I don't care if you have limited inventory. You have to use what inventory you have towards my order first before you worry about your other customers. There's also, besides the prioritization aspect of the DPA, there's an allocation aspect, which allows the government, the president, to allocate scarce materials needed for national defense. And so it is conceivable that if there are materials on the market that are in high demand for vaccines, therapeutics, or diagnostics, if we don't have enough of the raw materials we need for a test kit, for instance, then the president can issue allocation orders and say, I'm taking dibs on this much, or I'm rationing these materials so that people can't just freely buy them up the way they want to, because some of these are needed for my use as the federal government for national defense. And so there's been, I think Judy mentioned one of the newer provisions in the Senate passed bill, the CARES Act, which again needs to be passed by the House in the next day or two to become official, but at least as passed by the Senate last night, there's some provisions I wanted to highlight for you, because they're certainly consistent with the demand, consistent with the public emergency we're in right now. They're allocating a lot of new appropriations to this area to develop vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. So one thing that it did that's, I think, notable is that it actually clarified and sort of added a reference specifically for diagnostic tests to be items that are maintained in the strategic national stockpile. Right now, the language talks about vaccines and treatments, but does not really talk about diagnostic tests. And clearly, we see now with COVID-19 how having a robust supply of diagnostic tests can be really important. In terms of the money that's allocated, they're allocating an additional $27 billion to HHS for a number of purposes, but one of the purposes specifically is the purchase of vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and necessary medical supplies. So there's this large pool of money that HHS is being provided for the next 3 or 4 years to try to purchase some of these supplies. And getting back to the FAR provisions about cost and pricing, I did want to highlight that there is a proviso in that appropriation that says that the products purchased by the U.S. government with the funds that are appropriated have to be purchased in accordance with the FAR guidance on fair and reasonable pricing. Now, if there are commercial sales of your item that you can point to and say, I'm selling you in the same terms as these commercial sales, then that usually is enough to satisfy the government that it's buying something at a fair and reasonable price. But that's a standard that applies to the federal government whenever it's making a purchase. It has to be able to satisfy itself that it's not getting gouged. It's not paying an unfair price, an unreasonable price. And so if there is no existing commercial market, it's a brand new product and it's never been sold before, the federal government can ask for what's called cost or pricing data and ask you to sort of show some of your costs and your input into how you're developing your price, and can try to negotiate with you on that. So that's something to be aware of. The government clearly cared enough about it that they wanted to put it in there that, when you're buying these things, try to look out to make sure that there's some evidence that what you're getting charged is a reasonable price. And so that could be a consideration if you do develop something that you want to sell to the federal government, that they may ask you, how do I know I'm paying a fair and reasonable price? And with that, that's my discussion on government procurement. I'm going to hand it off to Steve and Crystal to talk about intellectual property considerations.
Great. Thank you very much, Frank. So as Frank mentioned, the last part of this presentation relates to intellectual property considerations. We know a number of companies are focused on the development of robust diagnostic tests for coronavirus, either laboratory-developed tests or other in vitro diagnostics, as well as vaccines and therapeutics to battle this pandemic. So we wanted to share with you some strategies for expediting patent prosecution should you choose to file a patent application. The first one is filing a petition for Track 1 examination. The goal of a Track 1 examination is to have a final disposition on your application within 12 months from the grant of the Track 1 petition. A final disposition could be a notice of allowance, but it could also mean a final office action. The application, to satisfy Track 1, the application has to contain a maximum of 4 independent claims and 30 total claims. And Track 1 is only available for a maximum of 12,000 applications a year, and it is for a fee. The fee is somewhat large relative to the other strategies for expediting prosecution. It's $4,000 for a large entity and $2,000 for a small entity. The next option is a petition to make special. In a petition to make special, the application can be advanced out of turn under certain conditions, such as the applicant being over the age of 65, or the invention will materially enhance the quality of the environment, or a number of other reasons. But there is then a catch-all phrase in this, and it says the application can be advanced out of turn, possibly for other reasons of importance. So under this possibly for other reasons of importance, we've reached out to the USPTO to ask whether this phrase would include applications that are related to COVID-19 focused inventions. The USPTO didn't definitively commit to this, but instead it said it would determine it on a case-by-case basis. Under a petition to make special, the application receives a first office action about 2.4 months from the grant of the petition request. Without such a petition, it usually takes about 15.9 months right now to get a first office action, to receive a first office action. I just want to add that the Korean Patent Office has created some special expedited procedures for prosecuting COVID-19 related cases. I wouldn't be surprised if other patent offices in other jurisdictions end up following suit. Another way to expedite patent prosecution is through PPH, the Patent Prosecution Highway. In PPH, if an applicant receives an indication of allowable claims from a participating country's patent office, or a positive PCT written opinion or preliminary report on patentability, the applicant can request to file a PPH request at any time before the applicant receives a first office action on the merits in its application. This takes about 2 months for the Patent Office, for the U.S. Patent Office, to act on a PPH request, and the time the case is pending at the Patent Office is about 166 days from when the USPTO grants the PPH petition. Next, we have the After Final Consideration Pilot Program, the AFCP Pilot Program. In an AFCP request, an AFCP request can be filed with a response after a final office action is received if at least one independent claim is amended but not broadened in the response. The examiner can then consider the response and conduct an interview without the applicant having to file an RCE. The USPTO can grant the AFCP request, but doesn't have to necessarily grant an interview. This is, as I mentioned, is a pilot program, so currently it's been extended once already, and right now will run through September 30th, 2020. And the last technique that we have for expediting patent prosecution is the full first action interview pilot program. Here, the applicant files a request anytime before the first office action. Often, the first action interview pilot program request is made at the time of filing the application. The applicant would receive, in the first action interview program, the applicant would receive a condensed pre-interview communication that outlines some of the rejections with regard to the claims in that application. And then and then the interview is subsequently conducted. According to the Patent Office website, you would feasibly get an allowance more quickly. The Patent Office website indicates that a first action allowance rate is 29% compared to 14% for applications not participating in the program. Because many of the patent applications in this space, specifically the diagnostic type inventions, can raise issues regarding patent eligible subject matter, we want to spend a moment talking about patent eligibility, so 101. There's a recent Federal Circuit case, Illumina v. Ariosa Diagnostics. And in this Federal Circuit decision, which is an appeal from a district court decision that invalidated all the claims under 101, the Federal Circuit found that the patented claims were patent eligible. The claims in that case were directed to a method of preparing a DNA fraction by extracting a DNA sample, and through specific processing steps, producing a fraction of that DNA that is enriched. And then there's also a step of analyzing the DNA. The Federal Circuit said that the claims were directed to methods of preparing DNA, and that this was an application of a natural law or a law of nature or a natural phenomenon, and therefore it was patent eligible. So although the claimed method could be performed as part of a diagnostic method, the majority viewed the claims as distinct from a diagnostic method and stated as such. So that's not to say that all diagnostic methods are not patent eligible. Based on guidance and case law, patent eligible subject matter could also be in diagnostic methods that involve novel primer designs, if they are labeled, and especially if the diagnostic method provides an unexpected result. Other potentially patentable subject matter are diagnostic methods with some unconventional steps that amount to something significantly more than the judicial exception. And of course, treatment methods still remain patent eligible. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, Crystal. I'm going to pick up with some discussion about vaccine patent strategy. And it's fairly well established that vaccines are protectable subject matter under U.S. patent law. And a common type of claim that's used in patents for vaccines relates to an immunoprotective composition that may include various key vaccine components. The compositions, for example, may include isolated antigens or virus-like particles, combinations of viral proteins, or other non-naturally occurring components. So it is possible to obtain protection on the vaccine product itself. In addition to that, methods of treating or immunizing subjects against virus infections are also patentable. And finally, it's also possible to obtain protection on a method of making a vaccine. There are some aspects that may be challenged on eligibility grounds, as Crystal was talking about before, but for the most part, there are ways to navigate around the eligibility requirements. I'd also like to talk a little bit about some unique patent licensing and enforcement considerations. Recently, there was some news about the owner of Theranos' IP after the company failed. A group of investors purchased the rights to certain IP that Theranos owned, and initially there was an attempt to bring an enforcement action against a number of diagnostic companies. And this led to kind of a public backlash, and in the end, the owners of the patents decided to offer a royalty-free license for entities who were doing COVID-19 related work, which points out that it can be, it's challenging to enforce patent rights during a pandemic, and not to mention it may be just not the right time to do it. And another dimension to enforcement considerations is compulsory licensing, and the fact that in some other jurisdictions there are laws that allow for the government to grant compulsory licenses, which is what occurred in the case of a product called Coletra, where Israel approved the import of a generic version of Coletra, which previously was used for treating HIV, but they granted the compulsory license for generic production to be used against coronavirus. Shortly after that, the owner of Coletra announced publicly that it would not be enforcing its patent rights anywhere in the world relating to that product. So I think in part there may be a recognition of the difficulty of trying to enforce patents during a pandemic that was at work here, and also sort of the public relations aspect of it. So with that background, you may ask, well, what's the point of patenting? There still can be a lot of value in obtaining patents, and one reason is that the claims of a patent are often broader than just treating the particular condition that's a pandemic right now. For example, there may be other strains of coronavirus that could be treated besides the one that's the COVID-19 strain, or the claims may cover a product that has broader antiviral activity against other types of viruses. And even in relation to the COVID-19 situation, it may be valuable if governments decide to stockpile against future outbreaks. So after the current pandemic subsides, it may be the case that the U.S. government wishes to acquire additional quantities of these treatments to protect against future outbreaks. And as Frank mentioned, we now know that the diagnostics may soon be added into the law that allows for the U.S. government to stockpile products. So you may see an expansion of what the government determines is useful for stockpiling. And of course, patents relating to vaccines can be valuable, even after a pandemic subsides, in order to immunize future subjects against the threat of coronavirus. So there are plenty of reasons to still consider patents, even though there are challenges associated with their enforcement. The next few slides I'm not going to go over in detail, but we wanted to provide them to you to give a sense of the depth and variety of COVID-19 candidates that are already undergoing clinical trials, or at least are contemplating undergoing clinical trials. And so we've provided a list of there's over 120 clinical trials that are being proposed or are actively recruiting or are underway related to products for COVID-19, and not only the ones that are getting a lot of press, but you'll see on this list that there are many, many others where people are attempting to either repurpose existing drugs to treat COVID-19, or they're trying completely new therapies that have never been approved before. So again, I'm not going to go into detail about all of these, but you'll be able to review them afterwards and pull them up to see the full list. And the source of this list, by the way, is clinicaltrials.gov. It's a website that lists all the current clinical trials, and if you just type coronavirus infection into the search field, you'll be able to pull up the same list, and then you can click on each trial and get even more information if it's helpful to you. And so with that, I would like to open it up for question and answers. And there have been a couple of questions that have already been answered, but there are some that I'd like to raise right now. One of the questions is for Judy. CLIA has previously published a frequently asked question on provider survey certification during healthcare emergencies. The frequently asked questions at section B1 indicates that new labs can begin testing as soon as they submit their CLIA application. Is this in effect right now, and does this apply to companies seeking recertification?
So this is Judy. So I think I mentioned previously that I spoke with CMS earlier this week, and I was specifically asking them about the high complexity labs, which if you look at the CMS manuals, say that while you can start testing for the other levels of certificates, that for the high complexity that you need a survey first. And he confirmed that you don't need a survey first, and told me that they can get you CLIA numbers, not the certificates, but the numbers within 24 hours. I heard from someone else that it was 48 hours, but either way, I think that's pretty reasonable. And that once you have the CLIA number, even though it takes some time to get the CLIA certificate, that you can go ahead and start testing. So you're making a representation, of course, when you apply, that you meet the qualifications, and those are set forth in Part 493. They differ a little bit depending on the complexity for high or moderate. So it's not that CMS is, excusing you from any of that compliance, but they will go ahead and let you start testing until such time as it's a survey. And then I'm not sure I understood the question about recertification, but I think if you're talking about like the renewal of your CLIA certificate, that really shouldn't be a problem. I'd also say that Nate noted previously that the FDA folks have been very, very available. So too have the CMS folks. I have their wife's cell phone numbers, and they will. You can reach out to them at their CMS numbers, and they will also put you in touch with the state folks who've also been very responsive. So I think CMS is very committed to getting this done very quickly, but you do need to get a certificate, and you need to meet the requirements for that certificate.
Thanks, Judy. Next up, we have a question for Frank, I think. The question is, does BARDA have a specific small business set-aside program similar to SBIR's?
I'd have to look at that. I know that they typically, they try to make awards to small businesses in the broad agency announcements, but I don't know if they have a certain portion of their research budget that's set aside, and whether they have. I know NIH has an SBIR program that might be where the small businesses get funneled to for sort of dedicated small business awards, but I'm not certain on whether BARDA has a set aside program itself, or whether it just does these broad announcements, because set-asides are typically, they're a limitation on competition, and that are permitted under social policies from the federal government in its procurement policy. But these broad agency announcements are also an exception to the full and open competition. They're considered full and open by sort of announcing we have this interest, and then they're able to make awards based on sort of the merit of the proposals they receive. So that's what I would say.
Thanks very much, Frank. And by the way, for those who have questions that we're not able to get to, please feel free to follow up with any of today's presenters and contact us with additional questions. We have another question on the IP side. If an entity decides not to enforce its patents during the pandemic, can there be long-term consequences for the patent? And the answer is yes, as a general matter. If a patent owner chooses not to enforce a patent after being aware of infringement, there can be negative consequences in terms of the ability to try to assert that patent in the future against the same party. I think the better course of action, if a particular patent owner wants to forego suing a certain entity for infringement, it's better to reach out and directly enter into maybe a limited royalty-free agreement with that particular party that carefully defines the scope of activity that you're exempting them for, and that way you retain your rights for the future. So it'd be better to enter into some type of agreement that's party-specific and also lays out the boundaries of what activity you don't want to hold them accountable for. And I think with that we are almost out of time. I'd like to thank the presenters and thank the audience. We had some great questions. And again, please feel free to contact any one of us with your questions. Also, check back on our Coronavirus Resource Center at Foley.com. We will be posting real-time alerts, and also we'll have a playback link for today's webinar so that you can access the slides that were presented and share with others who may be interested. We look forward to continuing to work with everyone throughout this challenging time and hope today's program was helpful for you. Please take a few minutes before you log off to provide feedback about the presentation via the questionnaire that will appear on your screen. And with that, I'd like to thank you again and hope everybody stays healthy and hope we can support your needs in the future. Thank you.